After the Japanese army invaded Western Yunnan, they put Japanese army currency into circulation and forced everyone to use it. The Japanese army in Western Yunnan seized agricultural products, medicine and other goods without paying for them to meet the army's demands, and they forced everyone to use the Japanese army currency. Scholars estimate that in just 2 short years, the Japanese army seized everything of value in Western Yunnan. The area wasn't able to recover economically until several years after the war. When the Chinese Expeditionary Force finally attacked Longling, the Japanese army's abundant store of supplies enabled it to mount fierce resistance. In the middle of July 1944, 5 divisions of the 71st Army Group of the Chinese Expeditionary Force, totaling 30,000 troops, launched the second offensive to encircle and capture Longling. The Japanese army quickly dispatched the 36th and 2nd Divisions, totaling more than 15,000 troops, to reinforce Longling, and they launched a fierce counter-offensive against the Chinese Expeditionary Force. Wang Dewu, a soldier in the 71st Army Group, recalls the Battle of Longling thus: "We had just finished digging trenches and hadn't yet covered them with planks or set up our machine guns when we heard a cacophony of noise coming from the Japanese lines. Less than a minute later, we were hit by an artillery barrage that hit a screen wall protecting our position, which then came crashing down on our machine guns. A number of soldiers right next to me were killed on the spot. We fought the Japanese for more than 20 days without being able to take Longling. Later I learned that our 2 divisions were almost wiped out and only about 2,000 of us had survived." The command headquarters of the Chinese Expeditionary Force had not expected the Japanese army to be able to mount such a fierce counter-offensive. Commander Wei Lihuang realized that the Japanese army must have made major strategic changes. In the past, the Japanese army had sent only a small number of reinforcements to positions under attack. How had the enemy been able to deploy more than 10,000 soldiers to Longling so quickly? Wei Lihuang's many years of military experience had sharpened his intuition. He decided they must be making a show of force. He asked to consult with the commander of the Allied Air Force and asked him to monitor Japanese troop movements on the Yunnan-Burma Road. An American reconnaissance plane had taken photos of the Yunnan-Burma Road on several successive days. What was strange was that the road was dotted with small groves of trees. But every day the groves of trees were in a different position and then finally disappeared altogether. Wei Lihuang immediately ordered the intelligence branch to thoroughly investigate these moving groves of trees. The guerrilla scouts reported back that they were Japanese military trucks and tents. All the trucks were covered with green camouflage netting and were newly painted with tree-like patterns. Soon thereafter, the Chinese Expeditionary Force headquarters received a report from the Burmese underground resistance that said that nearly 4 divisions of the Japanese 33rd Army were moving toward the Chinese Expeditionary Force positions at Mangshe and Longling. The Japanese army had indeed completely changed its strategy. In July 1944, the Japanese army had been forced by circumstances to change its plan of counterattack. At that time, it lost the important Battle of the Hukong Valley and lost control of Mietkina. In order to continue to disrupt land transport between China and India, Masaki Honda, the commander of the Japanese 33rd Army, decided to shift from taking the offensive to taking the defensive against the Chinese army in India. He then shifted the main body of the 33rd Army eastward to Western Yunnan to stop the large-scale counteroffensive mounted by the Chinese Expeditionary Force. This strategy would at the same time block the reopening of the communications line between China and India. The specific plan was The garrison force would defend Longling to the last man. The main body of the 33rd Army and the 2nd Division would join forces and quickly take Mangshu southwest of Longling, and then reinforce the 56th Division in Longling and wipe out the main body of the Chinese Expeditionary Force that was encircling Longling. All the while, they would continue to cut off the communications line between China and India. As a result of this change of strategy, the Japanese defensive forces in northern Burma were strengthened, preventing the Chinese army in India and the Chinese Expeditionary Force from joining forces. The Japanese had to wait till the army fighting along the Nujiang River was victorious, and then it could join the Battle of Northern Burma. When the Japanese implemented this plan, it had an effect on the entire Western Yunnan Northern Burma theatre. The 33rd Army set up headquarters in Mangshu in preparation for launching an all-out offensive in September or October. When he learned of this bold plan, Wei Lihuang immediately launched a third attack on Longling. Wang Jie was commander of the 11th Group Army and commander of the 6th Army. He wrote, "I took command of the 11th Group Army in September 1944. My mission was to recapture the 4 strongholds of Longling, Mangshu, Jiufang and Wanting. I was also to open the China-India road and reopen the international road line." At the end of October, all units of the Chinese Expeditionary Force launched the third all-out attack on the enemy defences at Longling. Wang Dewu, a soldier of the 71st Army Group, recalled, "When we launched the third attack, we were fully prepared. After softening the enemy up with an artillery barrage and sorties by American P-38 fighter planes, several divisions simultaneously encircled the city, and after fierce street fighting, we pushed the Japanese army into a small defensive position. During the street fighting, we advanced block by block to the city centre, and we fought the Japanese at close quarters. Sometimes we would hold one side of the street and they would hold the other. We could see their machine guns clearly." On November the 1st, the Japanese were encircled. The Chinese were pounding the Japanese stronghold in the city centre with 300 cannons, while American planes bombed them from above. A Japanese soldier could not shake off his terror of the Chinese assault. After nightfall, someone asked which squad should attack the Chinese. If the kamikazes went out, they should wear white headbands, but some of them put on Chinese uniforms. The next morning, most of those who went out didn't come back. I guess the Chinese army was waiting for them. In the end, the Chinese didn't come and capture our position. We sent out one group of kamikazes after another, and they all never came back. Because the 2 strategic strongholds of Mount Songshan and Tangchong had already been captured, the strategic plan the Japanese had drawn up was already useless. It was reported that the Japanese commander Masaki Honda cried bitterly in regret that the cause had been lost. He issued the order for everyone to fight to the death, and the remnants of the Japanese army prepared to flee west toward Mangshu. An officer in the 113th Company of the Japanese 56th Division said that he was lucky not to have been wounded. The Chinese artillery fire was very heavy. One of my friends had both of his legs blown off by an artillery shell. He stood up on the bloody stumps of his legs and screamed hysterically for someone to give him a machine gun. Right in the middle of screaming, he fell over and died on the spot. There were 30 men in a bunker who were too badly wounded to move. They said to the captain, "We're not going to get out of here alive. Shoot us now. If you can't do it, give us a gun and we'll do it ourselves." They passed the gun from one to another, each one putting the barrel to his temple and pulling the trigger. A few of them couldn't pull the trigger themselves, so the captain did it for them. The Chinese Expeditionary Force recaptured Longling before dawn on November the 3rd, 1944. Wang Jie, the commander of the 11th Group Army, recalled, "I stormed and took Longling 3 times. After the first 2 times, the enemy brought in reinforcements and took it back. This was the longest campaign involving the most troops and resulting in the most casualties of any campaign we fought in the war. There were 28,384 Chinese soldiers who lost their lives in this battle, and we estimate the enemy dead at 10,620. The campaign that enabled the recapture of Longling, Mount Songshan and Tangzhong is known in world military history as the Battle of Longling. This is the only large-scale battle between Chinese and Japanese troops in the anti-Japanese war, and in this battle, the Chinese completely annihilated the Japanese army. The Japanese 56th Division was known as the Dragon Troop because of its high combat capability, but it was annihilated at Longling. Shortly after the Longling campaign, the Japanese Army Command retired its number in honor of its heroic sacrifice at Longling. After the Chinese Expeditionary Force recaptured Longling, it eliminated the remaining pockets of resistance from the whole of western Yunnan that it had once had under its heel, pushing the Japanese invaders into the strategically indefensible flatland around Mangshu. The battered remnants of the Japanese army retreated westward from Longling and linked up with what was left of other Japanese units at Wanting in hopes of stemming the tide of the onslaught of the Chinese Expeditionary Force and forcing a stalemate. It was decided at the highest levels of command in the Chinese Expeditionary Force that now that they had the Japanese reeling, they couldn't let them get a second wind, so a strong force was immediately sent to attack Wanting, and that attack began on December the 27th. Wang Jie accompanied Commander Wei Li Huang to observe the fierce fighting on the front lines. He recalled, "I accompanied Commander Wei Li Huang and American General Wedemeyer to observe the battle. The Japanese were well dug in, but we pulverized their fortifications with our artillery and American bombs. Nothing was left of the once thick forest but a number of bare tree trunks, some of which had body parts from dead enemy soldiers hanging from them. It was very disturbing." A Japanese soldier who survived the battle wrote in his diary of seeing his commanding officer completely lose his mind due to desperation caused by the crushing defeat. "My commander thought that it was cowardly and stifling to stay hunkered down in our fortifications, so he charged out like a madman. He didn't get more than 2 steps when half his face was blown off. He died without making a sound." The Japanese army's will to fight was completely broken. It just disappeared in a flash without a trace. Xiong Xinmin, vice commander of the 88th Division of the Chinese Expeditionary Force, recalled the following. "The Japanese had retreated to hilltop strongholds at Zhefang and Wanting, where they had built strong fortifications. We sent reconnaissance patrols to scout the enemy positions. Our patrols went right up to their bunkers and discovered there was no sign of Japanese troops at all. They waved their hands and shouted, 'There aren't any enemy soldiers here.' I immediately ordered my troops to attack. They quickly crossed Wanting Bridge and went into the city centre without seeing a single enemy soldier." Materials published by the Japanese army described the army's collapse. "We threw all we had into the battle, but there was no time to change our tactics. We estimated that the army could survive for, at most, another week. On January the 20th, the 56th Division collected and destroyed most of our munitions, and then sent its last message to Army headquarters, saying it was abandoning its position." The Japanese army was fighting and retreating at the same time, both hopelessly battling the Chinese and equally hopelessly fleeing. Takuhiko Hashimoto remembers the confusion and disorder of the retreat of the once highly disciplined Japanese troops. The situation along the evacuation route was more horrific than you can imagine. When a soldier fell by the wayside unable to go on, his fellow soldiers would pounce on him while he was still breathing and take his food, boots and equipment and then leave him there to meet his death. If Chinese troops came along, you had hope of being captured and surviving, but if Japanese troops came along, you were sure to die. In January 1945, the Chinese Expeditionary Force attacked fiercely everywhere throughout western Yunnan and northern Burma. After retaking Wantian, it took Mangyou and Mengmao. The Japanese Army's escape route down the Yunnan-Burma road was cut off, and the remaining soldiers fled west, with the Chinese Army in hot pursuit. 3 months earlier, after the end of the monsoon season in Burma, the Chinese Army in India had set out for Barmore. The Japanese had an airbase there, and it was well defended. After the Japanese had been dislodged from Myitkyina, they'd reinforced their defences at Barmore and installed numerous heavy machine guns. They swore they wouldn't be ousted from Barmore as they had been from Myitkyina. It was going to be very difficult for the new 38th Division of the Chinese Army in India to capture Barmore. However, the attack on Barmore was very methodical. Every morning at first light, American Army planes bombed the Japanese positions, and then the Chinese began an artillery barrage. Finally, infantry troops advanced together with tanks. It was all done unhurriedly. Whenever they captured a position, they quickly repaired the fortifications to defend against a Japanese night attack. The Japanese were very fond of night attacks. They thought they had the advantage in night fighting. But they didn't know that this tactic had lost its effectiveness. A Japanese soldier recollects. The men who went out on night missions were the boldest and most resourceful soldiers. But the Chinese Army already figured out our modus operandi. They would light up the sky with flares, and the Chinese would concentrate heavy fire on each of our soldiers that they saw. Of course, the dead wouldn't move, but the injured ones wouldn't move either. They had already lost their will to live. Japanese soldiers couldn't be defeated in hand-to-hand combat, but the Chinese soldiers never let them get close. The Chinese always had plenty of ammunition. Victory and defeat were determined by supplies. We Japanese soldiers only carried 30 to 40 bullets in our leather pouches. With our severe shortages of ammunition and food, it was only a matter of time till we were crushed. The new 38th Division exhibited confidence and control in its attack on Barmore, and its enormous equipment superiority undermined the Japanese Army's faith that they could win. A Japanese soldier recalled, "There's a picture in a photo book glorifying the Japanese Empire. It's of airplane pilots wearing white headbands sitting quietly in their airplanes. Where were all those brave, healthy young men? We never saw them." It was said they couldn't fly relief missions because they didn't have any aviation fuel. We still don't know if the problem was the Air Force lacked fuel or it lacked guts. We didn't get any air support, and that's why we had no hope of victory. While the Japanese troops suffered the torment of awaiting their moment of death, they were treated to the spectacle of their commanding officer going insane. We organised a counterattack, but suffered very heavy casualties. After returning to our position, a soldier came up and said that the company commander had gone insane. I said, "What?" He said, "He took off his helmet, threw away his sword and went off to catch butterflies." I crawled forward and looked. I saw our captain without his helmet, bending over watching a butterfly flitting around in a patch of dandelions. When the butterfly flew away, he kept staring vacantly at the dandelions. On December the 15th, 1944, the new First Army of the Chinese Army in India captured Barmore. A month later, it captured Nam Kam. On January the 27th, 1945, the Chinese Expeditionary Force and the Chinese Army in India joined forces at Mangyou near Wantian. and the next day the entire length of the China-India road was opened to traffic. This valuable film footage was shot using colour film, which was very expensive at the time. It records the scene when the Chinese Expeditionary Force, the Chinese Army in India and the Allied Army victoriously joined forces at 1:10. One can clearly distinguish the Chinese Expeditionary Force from the Chinese Army in India in this film footage of a simple flag-raising ceremony. The soldiers of the Chinese Expeditionary Force are wearing traditional Chinese Army uniforms. The soldiers of the Chinese Army in India, on the other hand, are wearing Americanized uniforms with steel helmets, and they are standing with American, British and French soldiers of the Allied Army. Commander Wei Lihuang flew into Wanting to personally review the troops and proclaim victory in the Western Yunnan campaign. He declared, "This is the first step toward joining forces in Tokyo." The commander of the American forces declared, "May the flags of our two countries soon fly in the sky above Tokyo." The speeches of both leaders were drowned out by the cheers of the roaring crowd. After 3 years and at a cost of the lives of more than 100,000 brave young men, the Yunnan-Burma Road was finally reopened. China was again linked with the countries of the World Anti-Fascist Camp. Chinese and American soldiers and members of tank, artillery and infantry units all wore broad smiles as if they had been relieved of a heavy burden. Today, most of the people in this film footage have already passed away, but fortunately, their influence still lives on. This fading footage confirms a famous military saying, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away."